Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for attending the Centre for Independent Studies this evening. My name is Dr. Jeremy Samet, and I'm a Senior Research Fellow here at the Centre. It's my pleasure to welcome our distinguished speaker, the Honourable Andrew Robb, and to introduce tonight's topic, which is the implications of President Donald Trump's trade policies for Australia. As we approach the anniversary of the first day of the Trump presidency, the fourth decision taken by the Donald in the White House is probably the most popular, remains the most significant for us. This is the executive order scrapping the plan-specific partnership for trade agreement, which Mr Robb negotiated on Australia's behalf in his role as the research department from politics as Minister for Trade and Investment in the Abbott and Turnbull Government. President Trump's scrapping of the TPP was consistent with his campaign rhetoric during the 2016 presidential election, and it could be interpreted as the first step ushering in an era of Neo-Protectionism in US trade policy. But the purpose of tonight is to consider what Trump's trade policies mean for Australia, given the potential impact on international trade and the global economy, and the potential impact on domestic politics too. Now, these issues are vital to our national interests. The last 25 years of unprecedented economic prosperity have been underwritten by the shift away from a historic reliance on protectionism and the reduction and virtual elimination of tariffs, which began in the 1980s and enjoyed bipartisan support. This is also to say that as a small trading nation that is dependent on foreign investment, our future prosperity is threatened by the rise of neo-protectionism both abroad and locally. The political danger locally is the demonstration effect of President Trump. If preaching protectionism helped pave his way to the Oval Office, Australian politicians may be tempted to follow suit. We shouldn't be complacent, therefore, about Australia's commitment to free trade or understate the need to continue to make the case for why free trade is in our national interest. We also tend to think that Fortress Australia, as it was known, was always destined to be shivered behind high tariff walls for the first 80 years after Federation. But it's worth remembering that the Free Trade Party, led by George Reid, only narrowly lost the first federal election in 1901. To cut a very long story short, this put the Protectionist Party in the box seat to convert the Labor Party from free trade to protectionism over the course of the first decade of Federation. This ultimately led to tariff protectionism becoming an entrenched, until the 1980s, an untouchable national institution. Had the case for free trade been made more effectively in 1901, then maybe the political and economic history of Australia may have been very different. I think we should ponder this at a time when what we think are the established political and economic certainties are under attack from economic populist movements, both in Australia and overseas. Those who believe in free trade therefore need to be vigilant in continuing to make the case for free trade. Less political opportunism, combined with a latent nostalgia for the era of Australian-made, lead the nation to reverse course and head back down the protectionist path. The CIS is therefore delighted and privileged to have Andrew Robb here tonight, for there are a few people who are as well qualified by background and experience to speak about both the international and domestic side of trade issues. As Australia's Minister for Trade and Investment, Mr Robb negotiated the 12-country Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. He also negotiated free trade agreements with South Korea, Japan and China, as well as the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership with Singapore. Mr Robb was General Secretary of the Liberal Party of Australia, including his role as Campaign Director of the 1996 federal election, which brought former Prime Minister, the Honourable John Howard, into government with the biggest Liberal Party win in history. Mr Robb stood for Parliament in 2004 and was elected to the federal seat of Goldstein until retiring at the 2016 election. With a long and continuing career in the agricultural sector, one of Australia's most important trade industries, Mr Robb was a former Executive Director of the Cattle Council of Australia and a former CEO of Australia's peak farmers organisation, the National Farmers Federation. Among his current roles for a range of national and international business, he is board member of the Kidman Cattle Enterprise, chair of AsiaLink, and strategic advisor to the Beef Council. To Beef Innovation Australia. In 2003, he was awarded the Award of Australia for his service to agriculture, politics, and the community. Mr Robb will speak for approximately half an hour. We will then take questions from the floor. This is my colleague, Rebecca Piper, who is working on the report about trade in Australia. We'll round off the evening with a vote. So without further ado, I invite Mr Robb to address us.
Well, thanks very much, Jeremy, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for braving the cold in Sydney. It's so much different in Melbourne at the moment. I've long been an admirer of what the Centre has done for such a long time, and so I was pleased to take up the invitation to join you tonight. It is a difficult topic, mainly because of the unpredictability, I think, of the front and where things will in fact go. What I'd like to do tonight, if I could, is deal with the subject under sort of four related headings. Just broadly, the impact of the anti-free trade policies that they'll have on Australia and international trade and the global economy more generally. Secondly, in more specific way, the benefits of the CPT, the middle ground, and can it be reinstated, revived, or have to create other opportunities for us at the present time to consider. Thirdly, I'd like to look at the effect that Trump's success might have on the debate here in Australia. As Jeremy kicked off this, it's a debate that's been around for well over a century. And finally, low barriers to protection, because there's a very high barrier to awareness of what's going on in our region, I think, in many respects. And I'll happily engage in that conversation too a bit later. Seek to examine his relentless modus operandi. That's through the campaign, but also now in the first 100 days. My sense is that his modus operandi is to have a very loud growl, but a much smaller bite. And the growl is intended to play to the audience that elected him. Almost on every issue, he's something very cool stuff. Now that might be sufficient to satisfy the people who elected him, who I think in a way had a very legitimate concern. And it's not just in the United States, but I'm seeing it with Brexit, and you're seeing it here with some of the crossbenchers, and there is a concern about the way in which professional politics is now starting to I think more than ever before, in so many parts of the developed world, the democratic world, form groups that are running the country, sometimes one lot for a few years and another lot for the next few years, but they're a club. Increasingly it's a club. And increasingly they've drawn side against trading to ministers of the state or federal, increasingly, this is my observation, or into an investment bank. And they say, well, I've had 8 years in the real world, in an investment bank. Well, as a public affairs, now, I think that phenomenon I've observed across so much of the developed world. You know, I've been going to Geneva the last few years, off and on, and consider as I can, the arrogance, the disdain, just the total rudeness of the treatment I every time I got there was palpable. Here I was a cabinet minister from a country that was, I'd be talking to people about issues, opening up economies and growth. I come from an economy which was for 26 years now. We've had no recession. 26 years running up to economic growth. A lot of it off the back of the liberalised nature of our community. And yet I turn up there to unelected people with no accountability, the bureaucrats in Europe, and they would treat you as just table disdain. Be looking at their watch after 10 minutes, and they because they're unelected and unaccountable. That's a social experiment which is going to, in my view, got only one result coming. It might take a while, but we saw the start of it with Brexit, because it is creating a body of people who think they're supreme, and they act that way, and it's a very damaging. Now that's the extreme of it, in my view. But you go to Washington, which I've been to for the last 30 years, every year. It's a club. It's a club. Okay, there's two different strands of thought, but they're still, at the end of the day, they're still having dinners together, and you know, it's not as it should be, and that is people who, you should have people like, they're all good people, they've got the right motivation, but there's such a narrow body of people. Now that's where I think Trump was giving a voice to all those people who feel that they're being disadvantaged, because the people who are making decisions, both the politicians and the bureaucrats, more often than not, have become a club which is and knowing people. Policy decisions. So many of the people in many parts of many of these developed countries, the first one it is a very important habit to put in place. These days is in the sense of you confident yourself. moratorium on fracking. I mean, because if they can afford, a moratorium on fracking, they can't get money fracking the ones in the US. And that money, they want
particularly in the Asia Pacific?
Yeah.
Maybe zooming in specifically on a country or talking generally?
Well, I just came back from my 11th trip to China since last July when I left the country. There's so much opportunity up there for us. And so much of the xenophobic nonsense that's going on. I talked to some big companies out of some came to see me about buying farms. And I said, what do you want to do that for? Oh, we've got 200,000 supermarkets. We'll try and get supply for it. I said, you get the farm, 20 years later, you're probably working out how to run the damn thing. And secondly, it's not going to touch the diet with you. Oh, okay, so what do we do, right? So I can bring them some alternatives where they can their investment money to help Australians to, I mean, I'm not saying I shouldn't buy land, just at all, frankly. I mean, the top half of paid away by lefties for decades, and who can blame about that, you know? Well, it's you know, it is out. You all know. I could give you endless examples of where foreigners have come in and invested billions and gone out with their tail between their legs a few years later. But we're just playing again to a small crowd, in my view. And if they understood the consequence, but I can't tell you how many Chinese people come up to me and say, you know, having a meal or something, and they say, does Australia not want our involvement in? I mean, it's sort of just a general question. It's not angry or accusing me or anything. They just want to know, right? Because they keep hearing them, and I tell you, it gets beaten up there like, you know, like our press would beat up the reverse. You think they don't get it up there, because they do. The papers now are full of these sorts of issues. But my concern is that, as a version of what I was saying before, for 18 of the last 20 centuries, China and India were the centre of economic and political gravity. They weren't the centre, they shared the centre of economic and political gravity for 18 of the last 20 centuries. Both of them fell over in the last 2 centuries, and we all know about that. But they are, both of them, heading back inexorably to where they were for the 18th of the 20th century. Now, there'll be other people like the US that they'll share power with, and that's a good thing, right? But they're coming. And because, and as I was trying to point with that example with the company, they're going to be big enough and smart enough and all the rest of it, both countries. And this thing, everyone just talks about China. India is going to be bigger than China, you know, in almost every dimension within 10 or 20 years. And certainly amongst the people, and their average age, you know, they've got a very young population. And they've got a lot of things going for them that China has sort of got to get on top of. So, but they're both going to ride back. Now, if we, Australia, don't start to consider how we're not big enough to force anything, right? But there is a respect about Australia. We're not the threat to anybody. That puts us in a very strong position in lots of ways. It's a weakness, but it's a strength, right? And I just feel that the whole debate here is, as John Howard said, you don't have to give up a friend to make a friend, right? And so much of what I've dealt with in the last 3 or 4 years, especially in the US, but also in certain strata in Australia, is we can't have both the US and India. Now, I think, the US and China as friends. And that's why, you know, I do think getting a balance is also a good thing. That's what I like to keep talking about India, because they are coming, and they will be there. And I think it's a good thing to have balance between the US and China and India. And that bit of competition will be, I think, aid peace and stability in our region. But we've got to think about how we're treating some of these, well, just with our language and some of the things that we jump to. And if we get their respect, we can then say some hard things to them privately. You know, that was a stupid thing to do. You know, why are you doing that, etc., etc. But if you haven't got their respect and they feel you're just waiting for every opportunity to give them a whack behind the ears, then we can't play the role that we're well placed to do with all those three countries.
Now I invite my colleague Rebecca Wilson to give a vote of thanks.
Well, Andrew, it's an absolute pleasure and a privilege to give this vote of thanks to you tonight. I'm certain that I'm not the only person in this room that is deeply sorry that you left politics when you did. I think it was a great loss to our nation, but I'm sure that you had great reasons for it. I hope you're still a young man, and as Donald Trump has shown us nothing else, he's shown us that you can become president at age 70 plus, so I'm just having a little holiday now. It's been really wonderful, I think, for all of us tonight to hear such an intelligent, genuine defence of free trade. It strikes me as extraordinary that a policy which has brought choice and prosperity to billions around the world is so often so friendless. It's staggering. Only last Sunday we saw in the French elections that almost half of the voters voted for parties that don't back free trade. And they were on the left, like this communist back. You want. If you want to buy Australian, to buy Australian, but if you feel like buying something from Chile or from South Korea, that you can buy that as well. But if we look at the history of trade, for as long as we have history, because history was quite often written by traders, it's about so much more than just trade. It's about ideas. It's all the invention and people turning up from foreign lands with strange things. And, you know, like the gypsy that Gabriel Garcia Marquez wrote about, Melchiades, who turned up in the town with ice. And all through human history, these exchanges have enriched us. So I think it's been wonderful tonight to hear you speak in a very practical way, because I 100% agree with you. We can't talk about trade in ways that are just about, you know, GDP and per capita growth. People switch off. But when we talk about, compare North Korea and South Korea, even the CFMEU, I think, although maybe that it is better to live in an open, liberal trading South Korea than heaven forfend in North Korea and those poor people. I think you talked so interestingly and with such extraordinary experience stretching back 30 years about trade. And I was fascinated to hear your judgments about President Trump, and I have to say, reassured, because in the research that I'm writing, you backed up the sorts of things that, in my own modest way, I'm writing. So I might go back to the recording and transcribe them to have a few quotes to back me up as well. It's certainly true, as you've said, that in these first 100 days, Trump has proved that Teddy Roosevelt didn't know it all. Teddy Roosevelt said, you talk softly and carry talk loud or tweet louder. You carry a big stick and also go a long way. But I think, as you observed, it's also true that the growl is louder than the bite. And as we've seen, there's a lot of consternation, for example, even these weeks about Trump imposing 20% tariffs on Canada. Who would have thought that President Bush in 2002 put 27% tariffs on Canadian lumber? This is an old story. But the press, of course, want to write about Donald Trump, terrifying man, evil man, never going to get a Nobel Peace Prize. Whereas, in fact, a lot of what Trump is doing isn't that unusual, as you observed. And I think we also saw, one thing that Trump said is that, it's a negotiating tactic. I'm going to put 40% tariffs on China, you watch. And when he was challenged in the Republican debate by Ted Cruz, he said, well, I won't have to put it on because they're going to be frightened, Now give me something in return. Well, you know, you can smile, but when President Xi Jinping met with Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago, President Trump at Mar-a-Lago, he came away with access for US beef and access for US financial services, exactly like he said he would get. So, I mean, I'm not for that, and I don't think you were. I think you rightly said, you know, we can't be complacent, we can't be sure what's going to come next. But at least he seems so far to have been more moderate than one might have feared from his campaign rhetoric, because his campaign rhetoric was, let's face it, whatever else you might like about Donald Trump and the deplorables, and there is a lot to like about him, and especially about the deplorables, who are not deplorable at all, his talk was resolutely anti-free trade, and that would be a disaster, of course, for Australia, as you said. And so the reason why I wish you were still back in politics is that this week our new trade Minister, Steve Chobo, said that we're going to get a free trade agreement with Hong Kong, and I think great, even though I do recall that Hong Kong was Milton Friedman's pin-up for free trade. It's one of the most, if not the most, open economy in the world. But still, I think it's good to have an agreement, lock it in, maybe lock in guarantees for our services, which I think one of the great innovations that you had in the trade negotiations that you conducted. What was so great about it was that it covered services for the first time. And services is such an important and growing area of the Australian economy. It's also very important in the US. The US runs a balance of a surplus, in service trade services. So, but in any case, what I hope that Chobo has learned from you, and which I read in a very good publication, which the Menzies Research Centre, which I know you're on the board of, so praise you for that as well as the director over there. Some people would say I had some sort of vested interest in closing that land. It's not true. In any case, I think in a very good book that Andrew Bragg published at the Menzies Research Centre, he had a great quote. He had a lot about what you did, and anybody who's interested in what Andrew did in negotiating trade and services and trade in general, I recommend Fit for Service, which Andrew wrote. It has a lot about Andrew Robb as history and what you did, working with the Farmers Federation, how you pushed through, got an alliance, worked effectively with the Labor government of the 80s, Hawke and Keating, to push through liberalisation and took that through, and the culmination were these great free trade agreements. But one thing that Andrew said was that you and Tony Abbott set a deadline. 1 year, negotiate the agreement, and you delivered in spades. 3 free trade agreements that had bedeviled the Labor government, hadn't been able to deliver for 6 years. So I only hope that your successor takes the same approach. 1 year deadline, free trade agreement with India. And I think it's really one of the most important things we could do, because, as you say, such an important and growing economy. So I'd like to thank you so much for your talk. I hope you will come back again, and hope you'll come back into politics. But that's enough.
Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, and we hope to see you again at the fair soon. Thanks again, Andrew Robb.